With Diablo 2 Resurrected releasing soon, there's going to be a lot of players going through the game trying to find or trade for the best loot, so prices will be high for a bit. So in this series we're going to look at more affordable, or in most cases, easily and reliably solo farmable setups that will let you get your way through Nightmare in Hell. Today's entry, thanks to winning the popular vote on Discord, is going to be a Necromancer build, or more precisely, the Bonemancer. And don't worry, we will be doing more Necro builds in the near future for all you lovers of summons, poisons, hexy times, and more, but let's dive on in. If you use the normal Bonemancer guide, you should be good for starting stats and moving into Nightmare, but we want to do a double check on them because for a lot of people, this will be their first encounter with the series and will need a starting point for their Nightmare respec. Stat-wise, you should be around 50 to 60 strength, maybe a little higher if you found a Saigons and used it instead of a solid Necro head. Either way, that should be plenty of strength to beat the game, even on Hell difficulty, unless you find very specific things. The rest of your stats should pretty much go entirely into Vitality, since we'll very quickly get tools to handle the mana concerns you've had up to this point. Skills are going to sit somewhat similar. By this point you should have your 1-point wonder set up, at the very least your 1-point in Clay Golem and Summon Resist, and the curses you want to use, most people favoring either the Decrepify path to help the Mercenary and aid the Clay Golem's slow effect, or going Blind and Confused to basically break the enemy AI. Outside of that, it's all about getting the bones. You should be on your way to level 20 Bone Spear if not already there, and several points in the synergies at this point. My personal favorite being Bone Wall for its flexibility, but Bone Prison is good as well and is cheaper. Nightmare is also the point where you're going to want to start investing in Bone Spirit for specific boss fights like Diablo, the Ancients, and Baal especially, though only after Spear is finished maxing out. This is to keep Spirit from getting too expensive for its damage output. Obviously, going into Nightmare in Hell is going to greatly expand our gear options, even when talking easily farmable gear, so we're going to assume you have terrible luck with unique items and sets, and just can't seem to find the ones you want, since obviously if you find a Homunculus, it'll beat out most shields you could make, or if you find an Arachnid's Mesh, you won't need to be making your caster belt a super important thing in your life. And if you find a Stone of Jordan, you definitely don't need any rare or crafted rings in that slot. So just remember these items are suggestions for if you have a gap in that slot, since you can find or even make better if you have good luck on your side. In the weapon slot, you thankfully have two easy to farm options for the Necromancer that will beat out most other things you could even find. First is White, which is made in a 2-socket wand with the runes Dole and Io. You can find wands for this while going through the world, or from Act 2 normal Drognin, while you can make it in any normal 2-socket wand, and it is fairly easy to farm the rune word. If you spend a bit more time and get one with plus Bone Spear, you'll be a lot happier with it. This gives significant bonuses to poison and bone skills, and is how people make plus 8 Bone Spear wands, since it's plus 3 poison bone and plus 2 Bone Spear from the rune word. If you put it in a natural plus 3 Bone Spear wand, bam, 8 skill levels in one slot. The other option, Spirit, which can be made in a 4-socket sword with the Tal, Thul, Ort, and Am runes, is nice since it's useful for a lot of characters, not just the Necromancer. The easiest base for this is the Broadsword, since you'll find it in Nightmare and use Larzik, and it'll auto-socket to 4. Or if you use the socket formula, you'll still have a 50% chance of 4-socket. The Crystal Sword option is possible as well, but requires a bit more attention to detail, since it's pretty easy to get one that's too high in eye level and end up getting 6 sockets instead of 4, making it kind of useless for this character. On the subject of Spirit though, the reason we don't recommend it here for the shield is because you won't see it until Hell when you can get a 4-socket Monarch shield. Until then, you do need something though. I personally like going for stuff like Rhyme in a 2-socket Necro head on the cheap end, with Shale and Eth in a good 2-socket head with, say, plus Bone Spear, or if you can't find that, just grabbing an Ancient's Pledge with a 3-socket Kite Shield for Ral or Tal. If you come across a Lum rune, you can also do Eth Lum in a Necro head and make Splendor, which is fairly decent, though I usually hoard my Lums for other rune words. A similar situation for higher resist from Sanctuary with Coco Mal. It's kind of like your upgraded alternative to Ancient's Pledge, though I usually again want to save my co-runes for elsewhere. In the armor slot, I honestly usually just find myself using stealth from normal until I find a better unique. Though with a bit of luck, there's a few rune words you can use. Bone with Soul and yeah, it's 2 ums in there for plus skills, auto bone armor, and good resist is probably one of your best options outside of, say, like Enigma. Prudence made with Maul and Tyr has a pinch of resist too, though usually by the time you make any of these, you'll have found another armor upgrade from Stealth that'll make it so you probably want to be saving your runes for your post-game builds unless you have a ton of runes to throw away. Though speaking of rune words, in Nightmare, the Countess is a pretty good source of basically dropping runes like Shale, Soul, Am, Thul, etc., in addition to the ones you found in Normal, so it becomes fairly trivial to get a 2-socket helmet. Any non-magical one will do, even if you bought it from normal difficulty Charcy. Slap an Ort and Soul in it and you immediately have a solid helmet that'll work through Hell difficulty unless you find one of the better uniques. It becomes a lore, for those of you wondering. Moving on to your rings, resists are super important, especially as you get into Hell, though you'll likely have charms by now to cover those gaps a little, so also look for faster casts and, of course, as we said, resists, as well as mana and life, unless you get a Stone of Jordan, of course, which honestly would outclass most rare rings you'll even find at this point. So another option for unique rings would be like, say, Ravenfrost for a decent Cannot Be Frozen, if you end up using something other than Rime in your shield, that is. I'd recommend against wasting resources on crafting rings for this build though, but speaking of crafting, the other slots can give you some tools, especially if you're lacking in certain areas. For boots and gloves, you usually already have some items that will serve you well by this point, usually some faster run walk, resist, etc. But if you don't, you could look into either gambling for some rares or crafting some safety gloves, which give cold resist, or some safety boots, which give fire resist, as well as damage reduction and a handful of other rare modifiers. If you go to the crafting route, you want to use magic versions you find in Nightmare or later as bases, since the item level matters here, but thankfully just for the base item, the gloves and the boots. For the boots, you want to use Magic Greaves as the base item, and an Ort Rune, Perfect Emerald, and any junk jewel you have laying around. As for the gloves, take Magic Gauntlets, a Rawl Rune, a Perfect Emerald, and a jewel. There are also good uniques you can find by this point, like Mage Fist or set items like Saigons, but we're assuming you had bad luck. This is one of the reasons why we get that 60 strength. So you're close enough to get up to that 70 strength for the Greaves, or so that you can actually just equip the gauntlets straight out. On that crafting line though, we still have the belt and amulet to deal with in the amulet slot. The best you're going to even potentially craft is a +1 amulet until late Hell or even post-game. But if you haven't found better, you can make a basic faster cast amulet with a handful of rare mods by using a magic amulet, a Rawl Rune, a perfect amethyst, and a jewel. Though if you have a decent resist amulet already, it's not a big deal to just keep carrying on with that. On the belt front, it's a bit nicer to craft now, since you can buy sharkskin belts. Starting in Nightmare, these belts, at least their magical versions, can be used to craft caster belts, which give faster casts on a belt, something only one other belt does, and you won't find that until specific areas in Hell difficulty. To craft a caster belt, you get a magic sharkskin or vampire fang belt, combine it with an Ith Rune, perfect amethyst, and a jewel, and you're going to have a good belt for this build even if you roll mediocre on the mods. As far as Mercenary Gear, and this is how we solve our mana problems, most of it is going to be just a matter of getting him Life Leech and Resist through his armor and helmets. He can even get your hand-me-downs here, but the most important part of this build is going to be his weapon. You want to get your hands on a 4-socket polearm as soon as possible after reaching Nightmare. There's quite a few options for this, and just keep your eye out for gray polearms on the ground. What you want this for is so that you can create an item called Insight, with Rawl, Tyr, Tal, and Soul as the runes needed for it, basically. This will give you a lot of various boosts, but the most important one being providing meditation for your Necromancer, so you'll pretty much never have to worry about mana as long as your Mercenary is alive. As far as the Mercenary type, I go with Holy Freeze, Act 2 Nightmare Defensive Mercenary. Some people will complain about the random shatters from Holy Freeze, but the reality is it only sometimes shatters corpses, and while you will sometimes use Corpse Explosion, it's not a necessary skill to beat the game. It just smooths out certain areas with a lot of tight-packed enemies. If you don't like Holy Freeze, then a Prayer Mercenary from Normal is probably your next best bet, since you won't be having a high damage Insight at this point until later and can actually get trading for high-end gear. Basically, you can't quite justify that might option that a lot of people are really big on. Obviously, in all of these slots, except for, say, the Mercenary weapon or your, on-hand weapon, you can find better with a little luck. You can even find better wands. And you'll likely find sets or uniques that fulfill these needs better than these RNG smoothing options, but this is the affordable and reliable guide for people who may be a bit unlucky or just don't have time or energy to do the basic item farming and leveling. And don't worry, in the next Bonemancer video, we'll actually cover those endgame GG style items, but we've got to cover the other classes a bit first.